July 1985. Southern California was gripped by fear. Windows were nailed shut, lights were left on throughout the entire night. Families slept with weapons beside their beds. No one knew where the next attack was coming from, only that it was coming. Over the course of 14 terrifying months, a single predator would murder, assault, and terrorize communities all across California. While investigators struggled to connect the chaotic trail of evidence, the media gave the killer a moniker, and it froze the blood of millions: the Night Stalker. But this story is not about building a legend around a monster. It's about the families whose peace was shattered, the survivors forced to carry unimaginable trauma, and the systemic blind spots that allowed a transient killer to slip through the cracks long after the warning signals were already flashing. Today, we're shifting the lens away from the headlines to examine the victims, investigate the failures, and the ordinary citizens who finally took back their streets, and the decades of legal chaos that followed. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, the mechanics of justice, and what happens when the darkness finally meets the light. Tonight, we confront a haunting question. How many lives could have been saved if the pieces of this puzzle had been put together just a little bit sooner? Before we talk about the police investigation, though, and the media coverage and all the courtroom drama, I want to stop and remember who this story is really about. When most people hear the name, the Night Stalker, they think of Richard Ramirez. They remember the nickname, the scary, grainy mugshot. They remember the panic that swept across Southern California in the mid-1980s. But far fewer people remember the names of the people whose lives were taken, forever changed or shattered by these crimes. That's one of the uncomfortable truths in the true crime space. The person responsible often becomes infamous, and the victims slowly fade into the background. Their stories become reduced to a list of ages, dates, and locations. Tonight, I want to do the opposite, because before there was a serial killer making headlines, these were just ordinary people living ordinary lives. Many of Ramirez's victims were older adults. They weren't involved in any sort of risky lifestyle. They weren't expecting danger. They were sleeping in their own homes, in neighborhoods where they felt pretty safe. Some had spent decades building lives with their spouses. They had children, grandchildren, routines, hobbies, plans for the future. Like 83-year-old Jenny Vincow. She was a grandmother. She had survived the Great Depression, world wars, and countless challenges through her life. Her story is often reduced to simply being Ramirez's first known murder victim. But she was so much more than a name on a timeline. She was someone who had lived an entire life before becoming a part of this story. Then there was Maxon and Leela Needing, a retired couple in their 60s. Like many, they had built a life together and they expected to grow old together. Their names rarely appear outside of discussions of the crimes themselves, yet their deaths devastated family who were left trying to understand why their family had been targeted in the first place. Vincent and Maxine Zezera were another married couple whose lives were violently interrupted. Vincent was a proud veteran and a fixture in his community. He ran a popular local pizza parlor, and in many retellings, they are remembered for the brutality of the attack against them. What gets lost is that they were a husband and wife, parents, neighbors, and friends. And again, Ramirez targeted people in a place that they should have felt the safest, their homes. And while many victims did not survive, others have been forced to carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. Survivors like Maria Hernandez, who was a critical witness in the investigation. On a normal March night, Maria walked into her garage and found herself staring down the barrel of a gun. In a split-second instinct, she threw her hands up to shield her face, and the bullet struck the keys in her hand, deflecting the shot and saving her life. But her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki, he was already dead. Maria had to live with the physical and emotional consequences of that night long after the headlines faded and people went to sleep feeling safe in their own beds. But the horrors didn't stop with adults. Ramirez shattered the innocence of the entire region by targeting the most vulnerable among them, abducting and sexually assaulting children. Brave young survivors like 6-year-old Anastasia Hronas were left to carry scars no child should ever know, eventually being forced to look their attacker in the eye and point him out in a chaotic courtroom. For many survivors, the trauma didn't end when the attack ended. Some struggled with anxiety, nightmares, depression, the loss of their sense of safety. Imagine surviving something horrific and then being reminded of it every time you turn on the TV, every time you open a newspaper, every time you turn on the radio. Just another headline about the man who hurt you or killed your parents. This is a special and different kind of burden. Parents buried their children, children buried their parents, spouses were suddenly alone. And unlike the public, they don't get to move on when the next news story shows up. Their loss is a permanent part of their life now, while the story is entertainment for us. One thing that stands out when examining this case is just how random every victim appeared to be. All different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different age groups, and different walks of life. There was no clear profile that allowed people to assure themselves that this won't happen to me. That uncertainty created a specific kind of fear in Southern California. People locked their doors earlier. They bought alarm systems, slept with the lights on, stayed awake throughout the night listening for unusual sounds. But while the public feared becoming a victim, actual victims and their families were already living through nightmares. As the media coverage intensified, another pattern emerged, and it was troubling. The coverage began to focus on the killer himself. His image was on TV, the newspapers analyzed his behavior, reporters discussed his appearance, his beliefs, his personality. Meanwhile, many victims were mentioned only briefly, if at all. If it seems like I haven't had a lot to tell you about the victims, it's because there's not a lot in the source materials. We really don't talk about them much at all when you look up this case. It's a pattern often in true crime. Society is fascinated by the person who committed the violence, and the people who suffered are just a footnote. That's why it's worth taking a moment to remember that every name in this story represents an entire life. Favorite meal, a first love, family traditions, birthday celebrations, future plans that just won't ever happen. The Night Stalker became a headline. The victims, though, were human beings. And before we talk about how the investigation unfolded and mistakes that allowed Richard Ramirez to continue offending, we should remember that every delay, every misconnection, and every failure carried a human cost, not in statistics, but in lives. Before investigators could really understand who they were looking for, they first had to accept something very uncomfortable. They didn't even have a stable who to begin with. Richard Ramirez was not rooted in any one place or community. He was a young man from El Paso, Texas, who eventually just drifted west into California. Born into chaos, his early life was marked by severe violence from an alcoholic father, and his own sadism was encouraged by an older cousin. By the time he arrived in Los Angeles, Ramirez moved through the state like a shadow, sustained by his general instability and very heavy drug use. Methamphetamine fueled his erratic behavior and his ability to stay awake and active for days at a time. His life wasn't structured around work, relationships, or any responsibility. It was structured around survival, addiction, and opportunity. What made him especially difficult to track was his complete lack of a traditional paper trail. He wasn't tied to any home address. There were no bills, no utilities, no steady employment record, and no consistent financial footprint for investigators to follow. He existed entirely in the margins of L.A. He slept in cheap motels around Skid Row, drifted between neighborhoods, hitchhiked for transportation, and disappeared into the urban sprawl whenever it suited him. In a city as vast and densely populated as Los Angeles, that kind of transient made him effectively invisible. Law enforcement in the 1980s simply was not equipped to track a ghost. For investigators, his lifestyle meant they had no place to start. No home base to search, not even a homeless encampment where he may have made friends. There was no predictable routine to exploit. He wasn't just actively avoiding detection. He was living in a way that made detection structurally impossible from the beginning. What compounded the difficulty was his complete lack of a consistent method of attack. There was no signature, No single way that he killed that immediately linked him to the crimes in a specific area. In some cases, he used firearms, in others, knives, in others, blunt force trauma. The variation matters immensely because investigators rely primarily on patterns, consistent tools, consistent behaviors to determine when separate incidents are actually connected. This is how the behavioral sciences unit in the FBI was even created. They have found some of the worst killers of all time based entirely on the patterns of who that person was. When you know who they are, it can help you find them. But in the case of Ramirez, there was nothing to connect him to. Early on, the sheer variability blurred the lines. Many of these crimes looked like unrelated home invasions or isolated acts of local violence. But in reality, they were a single escalating campaign of terror from one guy. Even more confusing is the range of victims. I mentioned that earlier. No single demographic identified as at risk. Men, women, children, elderly residents, all on the table, all targeted in their homes, sometimes together, sometimes individually. This lack of predictability created a terrifying sense of randomness that made the public warnings almost ineffective. At least if he was attacking all elderly women who liked short skirts, then you could say, hey, if you're an elderly woman, maybe wear pants for the foreseeable future until we can catch this guy. But you can't just tell a population of like 20 million people, everybody be afraid forever. No one's going to take it seriously. And ultimately, that is what started to happen. Entire neighborhoods just felt exposed after they got hit. They didn't know, is he going to come back? Because the pattern simply suggested anybody at any home could be the next victim. So once an attack did happen in your community, then everybody went into high alert and everyone was worried. That's when people started nailing their windows shut and keeping the house lights on 24/7. Another aspect is the fragmented environment of Southern California. Los Angeles in the mid-1980s wasn't just large. It was broken into dozens of separate municipalities. Different counties, different city departments, and different law enforcement agencies were working in overlapping cases, but they didn't have a unified system to connect them. Ramirez could commit one horrific crime in one jurisdiction, and he would be miles away by the time the police even discovered it, slipping into buses, hotels, or entirely different neighborhoods before sunrise. This hypermobility, combined with the lack of real-time information sharing, created massive blind spots. Every local agency was looking at only one small piece of a much bigger puzzle, but no one had access to the full picture, and it raises an uncomfortable question that sits at the center of this tragedy. Would he have remained free for 14 months in the era of digital databases, facial recognition, instant interagency communication, or did the fragmented analog landscape of 1985 effectively create the perfect hiding place for a transient predator? By the time that law enforcement fully realized that they had a single coordinated serial killer, the case was already a logistical nightmare. The physical evidence wasn't sitting in one central police station. It was scattered across 4 different counties, a dozen different police departments, and none of them were talking to each other. If you look at a map of California, the sheer distance is staggering. The LAPD was handling bodies found in Glassell Park, downtown LA, and the San Fernando Valley. But then the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was handling separate attacks in suburban Whittier, Monrovia, Glendale, and Arcadia. And it didn't stop there. He was crossing county lines. The Orange County Sheriff's Department was investigating an execution-style murder in Mission Viejo, while police departments all the way up north in San Francisco and Placer County were trying to make sense of break-ins in their own neighborhoods. Each of these independent local agencies had a separate fragment. One department had a description of an orange station wagon. Another had a footprint from a backyard. Another had a ballistic report from a completely different caliber weapon from another police department. But in 1985, there was no fast, unified system to bring all of these pieces of evidence in one place. Detectives in Mission Viejo weren't automatically seeing what the detectives in Glendale were typing into their physical files. Investigators were effectively working parallel cases, blind to the fact that the man who struck 30 miles away the night before was now sleeping in a hotel down the street from the police station. At various points, communications gaps slowed the investigation even further. Different departments were now reluctant to fully share the details. They were worried about sharing things too early, sometimes out of concern because they thought they had a good lead, or they were worried about sparking public panic. In practice, though, it meant that critical information arrived too late to be operationally useful. And when the information was shared, it was sometimes handled with a level of public recklessness that compromised the investigation. One of the most jaw-dropping failures of the entire case involves the San Francisco mayor at the time, Dianne Feinstein. In August of 1985, Ramirez committed a brutal assault in San Francisco. Investigators there quickly realized that the shoe prints at the scene matched a very unique impression that was also found at Los Angeles. Specifically, these were a very rare pair of Avia athletic shoes. This was a massive break. It proved the killer was traveling between cities. But against the explicit pleas of the lead detectives, Mayor Feinstein held a televised press conference. Eager to show the public that the city was on top of the case, we're the ones making headway in the Night Stalker case. And she detailed exactly what clues the police had, including the size and rare brand of the killer's shoes. Ramirez, who closely monitored news coverage of all of his crimes, was watching that broadcast, and he immediately threw away his Avia shoes, completely destroying one of the most vital pieces of physical evidence that tied him to multiple crime scenes. The lead detectives were devastated. They watched their best lead wash away because a politician wanted a good headline. But the political blunders didn't stop there. Just weeks later, another critical error occurred involving a vehicle spotted in the investigation. Following an attack in Orange County, a sharp-eyed teenager spotted a suspicious man in his yard and then an orange Toyota station wagon leaving the neighborhood. The teenager was able to give the police a partial license plate. The police located the abandoned vehicle in a Rampart area parking lot. This car was a gold mine. It was virtually guaranteed to contain fingerprints, hair, all kinds of DNA. And so they were going to bring a specialized forensics team to come in and process the car with extreme care. However, before the forensics team could even arrive to dust the steering wheel, local officials leaked the discovery of the car to the media. News vans and reporters showed up to that parking lot. The intense public pressure to act quickly meant the vehicle's location was now broadcast on live television, where it was sitting completely unprotected in an open parking lot. The blunder caused mass confusion, and critics later argued that the rush to clear the scene in the chaotic environment risked severely contaminating or destroying the fragile forensic evidence before it could be properly recovered. Thankfully, they did get workable DNA and connected his fingerprints to an earlier arrest, but this could have completely destroyed this investigation. Beyond these individual missteps, the larger structural issue was the lack of a centralized database. Today, we have CODIS, which is the Combined DNA Index System. Think of it as a massive automated digital matching engine for DNA profiles. It's operated by the FBI, and there are multiple levels of access: local, state, federal. Essentially, investigators can compare fingerprints, trace ballistics, cross-reference cases across state lines almost instantly, but in 1985, we didn't have it. Everything depended on physical files, phone calls, handwritten notes, human memory. If one department didn't think to connect a detail to another case, that connection was delayed for weeks or longer. Looking back, it's difficult to separate the genuine mistakes from the limitations of the era. But what is clear is that the investigation was operating under conditions that made coordination and pattern recognition much more difficult than I think modern true crime audiences would probably understand. In a case involving an offender who moved quickly, unpredictably, across jurisdictional lines, even small delays in information have very real consequences. And when politics interferes with police work, it isn't just evidence that gets lost. They lost time. Time that the people of Southern California did not have. At this point in the investigation, they have a lot. They almost lost it, but they have the fingerprints from the car that was linked to a prior arrest. His mugshot is everywhere. The media saturation became its own kind of weapon. Posters, television broadcasts, front page newspaper. He was now officially one of the most recognizable fugitives in the country, if not the country, definitely the West Coast. What law enforcement couldn't reliably track in real time, the public was trying to identify instantly. Now, after that situation with the stolen vehicle, and it became a focus of the manhunt, and the fact that someone did see him who he didn't attack, Ramirez temporarily left California. He went to Arizona. He laid low for about a week. It was a brief attempt to disappear into anonymity again, try and shed some of the heat, reset his movements. But he did eventually return to Los Angeles County, slipping back into the same urban environment where he spent a huge chunk of his life. At one point, he was able to avoid detection at a local bus station where undercover officers were present. He later reportedly remarked on the difficulty of blending in when law enforcement tried to appear as homeless, suggesting that they were easy to spot and easy for him to avoid because they were too clean. A very chilling observation, because I think that shows that he was acutely aware of the margins he was operating within. But it didn't really matter because August 31st, 1985, he couldn't be invisible anymore. He slipped away from the bus station and he went to East L.A. He walked into a liquor store, just a routine stop in an ordinary, familiar neighborhood. He had no idea his face was on the front page of every morning paper. As he stood there, a woman in the shop closely looked at his features, connected the dots, and she screamed out in Spanish, El Maton, El Maton. That means the killer, the killer. In an instant, the abstract phantom from the evening news was a flesh and blood threat standing right amongst them. The fear that had paralyzed Southern California for 14 months now was collective fury. Panic took over, and Ramirez sprinted out of the store onto the street, desperate to find escape. He attempted to carjack a vehicle in the neighborhood, but the community refused to let him disappear. A nearby resident intervened, struck Ramirez with a tire iron to stop the car theft, and drew even more people to the chaos. Within moments, it was a chase. He's running on foot through the neighborhood, but ordinary citizens, grandfathers, fathers, neighbors who had spent a year locking their windows in terror pursued him. Crossed pavement, backyards, everything. A crowd eventually cornered him, detained him, beat him up a little bit, until the police sirens wailed in the distance. And when officers took him into custody, the manhunt that had stretched for 14 months and multiple counties didn't end with a carefully tactical SWAT sting. It was a neighborhood. They recognized a killer, stood up, and they took back their home. Is one of the most striking moments of the entire case, the point where the community is the final link in the chain of justice. Generally, at this point in the story, everyone's happy. We caught the bad guy. We're moving towards prosecution. This is going to be great. Well, it wasn't. See, by the time the case finally reached court, it was no longer just about what happened during the crime spree, but everything that had been happening since. It took 4 years to get to trial. The investigation, the frantic media coverage, the public fear, and the legal delays all stretched the process into something far larger than a standard criminal trial. What followed became one of the longest and most expensive criminal proceedings in California history. It cost $1.8 million in 1989. The only case to be more expensive was the O.J. Simpson trial. The sheer scale of evidence, 654 items entered into evidence, 165 witnesses. The number of victims involved, over 15. And the complexity of coordinating testimony across so many separate incidents all contributed to a process that moved at an agonizingly slow pace and ultimately took 15 months for the trial. But time did something else to this case as well. It fundamentally changed the defendant in the public eye. During that 4-year gap in custody, Ramirez underwent radical physical transformation. He received extensive dental work. His gaunt face filled out now that he actually got 3 meals a day. He grew out and began to style his hair. The man sitting at the defense table didn't resemble a disheveled, hollowed-eyed fugitive who had been hunted down in East L.A. He was presenting this highly curated version of himself that was tailor-made for the TV cameras that were suddenly in the courtroom. That shift in appearance played directly into a deeply unsettling cultural fascination. There is a staggering contrast in the early investigative files. Some witnesses described him in brutal terms, including a local LA librarian who recalled him appearing so unkempt he looked and smelled like a goat. Yet the media photographs and courtroom images show a different presentation, cleaner, composed, and to many people, unsettlingly polished. Inside the courtroom, the focus should have remained strictly on the lives he stole. But the cameras rolled and national attention fixated on the defense table. The trial degenerated into a dark, performative spectacle. And Ramirez actively played to the crowd on a daily basis. He wore these dark aviator sunglasses inside the courtroom. He would turn, smirk at reporters and cameras. He famously scrawled a pentagram on his palm, flashed it to the cameras, and said, "Hail Satan." Worse was the behavior of the public. The courtroom gallery began to fill up with something the media referred to as the Night Stalker groupies. Dozens of young women, all dressed in black, and they sat behind him during some of the most graphic forensic testimony. They flooded his jail cell with love letters and marriage proposals. This is the exact toxic trap of true crime storytelling. The terrifying ease with which we elevate the monster into a dark celebrity and ignore the people he harmed. Remember, the survivors and the families were sitting in that room while he was smiling and flirting with the camera. Children who he had sexually assaulted were still in the room with him. This was not a performance for any of those witnesses. Brutal re-traumatization. Testifying meant standing feet away from their attacker, reliving their worst nightmares in microscopic detail. Every question from attorneys required them to revisit moments they had spent years just trying to survive. The legal process demands clinical precision in testimony, but emotionally, it demands an impossible level of human endurance. And while the world watched all these daily headlines, the courtroom sketches, the latest antics of the man in the sunglasses, the people most affected were simply trying to make it through each day without breaking. What should have brought a sense of justice instead stretched their agony years. By the time the jury finally sequestered to deliberate, the trial had already left a permanent and exhausting scar on the survivors. On November 7th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. The judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty for the full scope of his convictions: 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. On paper, the sentence was absolute, final. The legal system had reached its ultimate conclusion. But in practice, that sentence did not bring finality. Ramirez would go on to spend 24 years on death row. That massive gap between sentencing and actual outcome is where the system starts to fracture. California's capital punishment system is shaped by an extensive appeals process, mandatory reviews, decades-long backlogs. Every case moves through layers of constitutional scrutiny because they are trying to prevent wrongful executions. But the result is a bureaucratic gridlock where a death sentence and an execution are often separated by a lifetime. For the families of the victims, this delay creates an agonizing state of suspended resolution. The conviction confirmed the guilt, but it doesn't close the book. There's no immediate endpoint, no final defining moment that marks the end of their legal nightmare. Instead, they're subjected to decades of waiting, periodic legal updates, the ongoing reality that this case remains technically active. Worse still, every mandatory appeal means that Ramirez's name is resurfacing in the news cycle, ripping open old wounds, forcing the survivors to relive the terror all over again. And this raises a difficult question that sits at the very center of the case. What does a death sentence actually mean if it's never carried out? For some, the answer is straightforward. The sentence itself represents justice. It firmly stamps the severity of the crimes onto historical record and permanently removes the offender from society. I mean, once you're on death row, you don't get to be around anybody else. You live alone. From this perspective, the absence of an execution doesn't negate the legal outcome. It reflects the cautious safeguards built into the system to prevent irreversible error. But for others, particularly the families left behind, the drawn-out timeline feels like a continuation of the original harm. The system delivers accountability, but it fails to deliver peace. Ultimately, the sentence never reached its intended conclusion. Ramirez died in 2013 inside of a hospital long before California even set an execution date. That outcome leaves the case suspended between entirely two different interpretations of justice. One view sees his permanent isolation as sufficient accountability. The other sees a broken system that promises a definitive end, but rarely has the operational capacity to deliver it. Neither perspective cancels out the other. Instead, they exist side by side, much like the complicated legacy of the case itself, because decades later, a haunting question remains unsolved for the people of California. Does justice come from the sentence that's given, or the punishment that's actually carried out? There's a common assumption about this case that isn't true. A lot of people actually believe that Richard Ramirez was executed, that after decades of appeals and public outrage, California finally carried out the ultimate sentence. But as I mentioned, that's not what happened. Richard Ramirez never walked into an execution chamber. He never faced a final scheduled date. He got a quiet ending in a hospital room, far removed from the crimes or the sentence imposed by the court. On June 7, 2013, he was transported from his cell on San Quentin's death row to Marin General Hospital. He was 53 years old. The official cause of death was complications related to B-cell lymphoma, a severe form of blood cancer. His health had been in steep decline for months, ravaged by his chronic hepatitis C and the long-term effects of heavy substance abuse that fueled his youth. In the end, the justice system had promised finality to the people of California, but did not deliver it. He remained a ward of the state, the financial responsibility of the state, and the conclusion of his life came through ordinary medical illness rather than a legal execution. This is a final unsettling tension in how this story is remembered. On paper, justice was served the moment that guilty verdict was read out loud. But the punishment that had been formally assigned by the courts was never actually completed. The ending feels almost entirely disconnected from the structure of the trial itself. And that leaves us with a conclusion that is simply deeply frustrating for the families who waited 24 years for an end date. The state sentenced him to death. Cancer got there first. When you step back from the headlines, the trial, the manhunt, the dark mythology around the case, what you're really left with is a long, heartbreaking list of lives that were just interrupted. Some ended, some permanently altered. All of them are real people who should never be reduced to mere footnotes in a larger story. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable questions, not just about the offender, but the system tasked with protecting us, about the timing, communication, how long it takes for separate pieces of information to become part of the whole picture, and the terrible price that gets paid when there's a gap. So it's worth asking, how many victims could have been spared if we could have coordinated just a little bit faster, shared information more effectively, recognized the pattern faster? Why do cases like this elevate the name of the person who caused harm, while the names of the people fade from public memory? And even after conviction, after sentencing, after 24 years of legal bureaucracy, did the justice system fully succeed because a jury delivered a verdict? Or does it fall short because true closure, for many people, never actually arrived? None of these questions have clean answers, but they matter because they shape how the tragedy is remembered after the physical details fade. Before we say goodbye tonight, a few quick notes. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been another episode of When Killers Get Caught. I'm going to be taking a brief production break for the month of July to prepare for the next set of deep dives, but I'll be right back with brand new episodes on August 6th. If you need a quick fix in the meantime, I've got short-form content rolling out on Facebook and TikTok, both of which are linked directly in the show notes below. I just want to say thank you all so much for listening, for supporting the show, and for walking through some of these heavy cases with me. But as we close out this chapter, I want to leave the media circus behind. This story has to end where it should have begun, not with the person who committed the crimes, but with the individuals who lived them. Richard Ramirez is remembered because of what he took. The people he harmed deserve to be remembered because of who they were and who they are. Good night.